Um, hey everyone, I'm Mark Stanislav. I'm a security project manager over at GrrCON. Hopefully you've had a chance to come by our booth. How many of you guys are software engineers of some type? Okay. How about security operations? How about normal operations, DevOpsy, Windows system? Okay. All those hands, you should be applying for jobs at Duo because all those jobs need to be filled. So if you want to work for the one security company that people actually like, now is your time. And why they like us is we have a lot of shirts. I don't think I can throw these very far, so I'm gonna. This isn't on camera, right? Oh, oh, all right. Okay, we're gonna rubber band them next time. So Schneier-isms as they go. The first real like security book I read was Secrets and Lies, and it's been a while, but when I read that, like one of the opening sentences is, security is not a product, it's a process. And when you take that to heart and don't just say that on your product marketing materials, it means something, right? And so because Duo is a two-factor company, we talk a lot about what two-factor can do, lateral attacks, bad things happening, breaches, so on and so forth. What frustrates me, though, is when someone takes something as effective as two-factor and then ruins it by doing everything else poorly. So I had some assumptions about, when people give their consumers two-factor, they do everything else better. Like they do web security better, they do other authentication things better. It's kind of that myth of security-forward organizations where you kind of see this like beacon of hope where they do something really progressive and kind of unique for their industry. And then you really kind of start looking under the covers and realize, oh, that's the only thing they actually do regarding security. So I wanted to take a more research-based, research-oriented view at this. I think it's great when you have some assumptions and, anecdotal evidence, but I thought I'd dive in kind of the long way with a lot of spreadsheet data and see what would happen. So what we're going to go through is I control for two-factor authentication. So what all these services we're going to talk about are some sort of like consumer-facing organization that all provide two-factor. So that's even, right? They all provide two-factor. We're still going to talk about two-factors and some interesting facts about that. But when we start talking about the other things these companies do or don't do, that's kind of when we start getting a little bit more resolution into how actually security progressive or focused they are as an organization. Data details on two-factor, on TLS, browser headers, cookies, breaches. So there's kind of a broad range of data that I collected. And then we'll talk a little bit about scoring that data to get something out of it that you can kind of apples to apples. Data is as good as I can make it. This is not scientific. This will not be published in any, appropriate academic journal anytime soon. But I did give it a fair try at getting all the data accurate. So data points. Basically 3 breakdowns. There's a little bit of extra data in here we'll talk about other than what's here. But if you do assessments, you do operations, you do development, a lot of these things hopefully are things you know about. They are hopefully things that you do, even if the companies we're going to talk about necessarily don't do. And as far as web application security goes, I have a pretty deep background in both developing and breaking. And this is a nice view of things that I would catch on an assessment or leverage, like, oh, they're not doing HTTP only for the cookies for sessions, and if I get like some crappy cross-site scripting, guess what? I'm going to steal their session. So basic things like that are very simple, like flipping bit to turn on feature in your like MVC framework or something that people just don't do for some reason. Talking to vendors about security things make them very uncomfortable when they're actually not security companies. Case in point, this financial organization I asked. So basically what I did is I not only looked these things up, but I also tried to get dates. It is very hard when you're not like a web 2.0 SaaS company. People don't talk about when they do stuff in like financial services. They're not like, hey, we released a cool new feature on our website. They don't really do that very often. And so it makes tracking down data really, really hard. So I went to Twitter, I sent emails, a lot of like really just like grunt work trying to get information as accurate as possible. And this company provides two-factor. And I said, hey, when did you add it? And they said they don't talk about internal security. Like they're just, I've worked on social media before. I know that the disconnect between what you do and what you're told to say or not say is gray area at best. But at the same time, like, you could have checked with someone to ask, like, oh, do we have this thing this guy's saying that we have, and when, if so, when did it come out, to be very helpful. But it was not always a super easy process, unfortunately. Two-factor. How many people have two-factor on something? It doesn't have to be Duo. It could be any number of things. Okay. So, two-factor, 2014 two-factor's reasonably pervasive. If you use Google or use GitHub, if you have a WordPress blog or a Drupal blog or something, you probably have some two-factor somewhere in there, some way or shape or form. As we can see, going from this data set starting in 2005 and up to July of this year, pretty drastic growth the last couple of years, right? And keep in mind that's up to July, so then maybe double that last column and get an estimation of that trend line, I guess. But these things, if you really take kind of a step back and look at 2011, big growth that year. And one of the things that happened in 2011, Google in January, February came out with Google Authenticator. And it was a free app, implements hot P and top P, open RFC standards to do one-time password generation. And they made two-factor more accessible than it really had ever been. Shane's not in here, especially compared to RSA. So it was something where people had only known like one way to do two-factor, and Google's like, hey, you can use this for free, and here's a free app, and go wild. And again, that was early 2011, and then if Google does it, why aren't all of us doing it, right? Like Google knows the roadmap to the future, so of course people are going to start adopting, and you start seeing a big uptick. If you could see more like granular in that, there's a big spike after Google's implementation. Facebook also in 2011. Most people don't realize Facebook has had two-factor since 2011. Maybe not super obvious where it is or which menu you have to click through, but they've had it as a consumer-facing feature, for 3 years now. Again, some of these might not be like, oh, holy, like, wow, that's crazy. One assumption I had was, how do people get enrolled? My thought would be a lot of it would have to be calling someone, faxing someone, emailing someone, like really like labor-intensive, old-school financial. You have to call someone up and then fax them 5 things to get your account to do something. And what it turned out actually is right now, as current data goes, right now, almost everyone that has two-factor, and there's about 140 sites and services represented in this data, by the way, of those, a vast majority actually make it super simple for you to set up. You go to your systems page for your account, click an option to configure something maybe, and go for it. The ones where you see phone call, email, or a mixed means of doing so is almost assuredly your old school financial. They still have hardware tokens they have to mail you, like TD Ameritrade, I think, has some of that. E-Trade. So not a big shock, right? People that have since like 2005 actually been doing two-factor, there's some accountability, like, hey, we've had this process in place since 2005, no big deal, we're just gonna roll with it. The actual ways in which you do two-factor is something that, and I can give you, of course, a little bit more visibility into two-factor than your average person. The adoption of two-factor is really predicated on the actual ease of use. And ease of use doesn't necessarily mean the method, but the availability to achieve your goal and get your work done. If you are on the road and you cannot log in to a site because you forgot your hardware token, your availability went way, way, way down, right? In the case of two-factor, we actually see a lot of different ways to do two-factor. Like, that's not a huge shock based on this list up here. But these are the methods collectively across the 141 sites. So that's why the number is big, because this is all of the methods across all of the sites added up, basically. Top P, again, time-based one-time passwords, RFC standard, open, you can use it, no licensing. Google Authenticator, Dual Mobile, both support that standard, so it's very easy to use, free to implement, basically. SMS adoption. A lot of you hopefully I don't know, hopefully. A lot of you probably have cell phones, and you've probably had a cell phone for a while. You've probably used SMS for 5-10 years or something. The data on SMS fees is pretty much nil at this point, or unlimited. So very simple to use. Like, my mom knows how to use SMS, therefore she could use two-factor in this means. And those two things are really, across consumer implementations of two-factor, the two that win. And the other thing we see, which we'll talk about a little bit more, is that big spike we saw in growth. One of the things that happened in that timeline is Bitcoin. And even though all these Bitcoin exchanges get owned like every night, their end user security has actually always been very forward, right? And they've put a lot of time to think about how do you protect the consumer, not necessarily how should we protect our actual like operational servers, unfortunately. And in the case of Top P, that spike that we see, especially 2012, 2013, and somewhere in there, a lot of that is because of Bitcoin companies coming up and inherently having two-factor as part of their service offering. And some other ones up here, just for what it's worth, like when I put Duo down there at 6, we actually have our own platform, our own API, our own means to do two-factor that's, I would say, considerably better than everyone else's. And we actually have people that build that into their service. And I think that's one thing that we would, of course, like to see more of. But for end users, there are a couple. How's your tattoo doing? Good? Nice. There are means to do two-factor in ways that are not super simple, like Top P, and then there's, of course, better ways like Duo. But of course, all of that, if you look at the broadness of that data set, 73% of anything hardware-based is all gaming and financial. Because why? Because they've been doing that way since 2005, 6, 7, 8, 9. They were before the era of Google Authenticator. They were before RFCs existed for Top P and Hot P. And they just quite haven't moved out of that space yet, and hopefully they will soon. Oops. Whenever you do research like this and you log into 140 sites and sign up for 140 sites, you see a lot of things, good and bad. Zoho, which, does anyone have Zoho account? I don't even know what Zoho is offhand, honestly. But when I signed up for them, when I logged in the very first time, I got this very specific, very helpful explanation of what two-factor is, why it's important, why I should turn it on, and an immediate call to action to do so. And that's something that we don't see often enough. I think a good example of that, Amazon Web Services, there was that one, I'm going to blank on their name, but they basically got their Amazon console owned. And when people kind of said, like, well, why didn't you use two-factor? They didn't realize that two-factor was a thing they could do on Amazon Web Services. And that is a huge problem. The knowledge of security features should be right in front of your customer's face, because that reduces your overhead, your help desk support questions, your liability. Everything goes down when people opt into security features that help them. So Zoho's doing it right, and if you are in a position to do so, that's something like that would be great. Methods, the number of methods, again, not a shock. Most of these are Top P. The ones that have 2 methods or more is probably a combination of Top P and SMS, because again, free, easy to do, quick to develop and implement. But there are some companies like MailChimp and OneLogin that actually have 5 different means of doing two-factor authentication. So getting back to adoption, if hardware tokens are your thing, or SMS is your thing, or phone callback, or push, or all these different technologies to do two-factor, they are setting like the pins up for you to knock down by saying, like, you can do this however you want. We're enabling you to do your own account security. We're enabling you to take that power over and do it however you would like. And hopefully that's a road that we see people go down further. Clavid has 6 methods, which is crazy, but they're the only one out of 141. So one kind of final departure with a little bit of the data is, two, and I don't know, maybe we'll do an informal poll, but two-factor authentication versus multi-factor authentication versus two-step verification versus factor verification versus, like, there are about a dozen terms for basically the exact same thing. And why I find this interesting partially is because Google is the first person to really come out and say two-step verification. They really coined that moniker. And so you see the growth there, and you kind of see it kind of trending back, well, more or less. One thing that's bad, in my opinion, when it comes to consumer security is confusing consumers. If we get them down a path where they know what multi-factor is or two-factor is or two-step, having like 3 or 4 or 5 different things to call the same thing makes it very hard to have them know, like, oh yeah, I didn't know we had two-factor. I knew you had two-step verification, and they're just like lost. And that's unfortunate, because I think you lose some, that signal to noise of what they should do to protect themselves. So again, it's one of those things that I think market adoption will eventually shift it one way or the other. And here's an example, name, was this Namecheap or something? Or NameSafe, sorry. They have two-factor, but you can bypass two-factor with one-factor. So you can effectively use, a challenge answer and a PIN and just completely just bypass two-factor authentication. And this is a problem. And actually some research I might go forward with in the future and look at what are the account recovery mechanisms when you have two-factor enabled, because I think across the board they're not very secure. They're actually just as bad as having a password. So something to think about when you're looking at organizations to do features with. What if someone gets your password? How much more work do they have to do to skip past your two-factor that you think is protecting the account? Here's a big glossary of terms, because I don't want to leave anyone behind. Assumably, GrrCON, very technical crowd. A lot of you know a lot of these terms. If you're not caught up super well, here's a quick time to catch up. This represents a very large, not all-inclusive, but a very large segment of the different kinds of browser headers that a web server can interact with a browser and say to do certain things or not do certain things. More recently, more progressively, Mozilla's been really steering around this idea of content security policy, where you basically send a policy to the browser respects that policy. So if you get you can do like DOM injection on my like interface because some coding bug. CSP basically says no, you can't do that because that's not part of my sources of script knowledge or content style sheets or something. So very progressive ways, newer ways like CSP, HSTS. So basically when you go to a site and you go to that site and they have SSL, every single time you go to that site, it will force SSL to help prevent man-in-the-middle attacks, SSL strip type stuff. And then some other things related to cookies. So one thing that's frustrating when you're looking at segments of data is your segments of data aren't always equal. So there's skewing and it looks weird. And so if you look at technology, which is a kind of a big grouping, there's a lot of those, very few retail. That's just the way things are. That's a data point right there. In retail, looking across every site I could look at, only 4 organizations that I consider retail have two-factor authentication. Concerning, yes. Companies like Amazon.com do not have two-factor authentication because they're worried it's going to slow users down. And slowing users down prevents that desire to buy things very quickly. That's why they have one-click shopping, right? That's a very obvious reason for them to do a very, psychological thing. So that makes sense. However, when you have things like social media, the percentage of social media organizations that enable these browser security features is actually very high. And I would say that's for 2 reasons. One is these are mostly greenfield companies. At some point in the recent future, they don't have technical debt. They don't have to retrofit. They don't have to deploy new infrastructure and deal with CapEx. Like they're just like, oh, we're going to spin up some EC2 servers and do this again. And now they have a new architecture that actually does all of this the right way. The other thing is social media, a lot of it is browser-based. A lot of attacks against social media have been browser-oriented, right? Whether it's phishing or clickjacking or what have you. So they have to be more security forward because a lot of the people are in the browser dealing with their services. If you look at financial industry, again, they do have a lot of technical debt. They do have a lot of systems they can't change on a whim. They don't have greenfields. And I think that shows in the numbers. They have very, very low numbers relatively. And across the board, the thing, and again, if you're not like a super browser security person, most of these features, save for CSP really, most of these features are literally like checking boxes or like updating a config file. It takes very little effort to add a lot of like aggregate security across features to help in the case of a vulnerability in a website or something else bad happening. So up to this point, I like winners and losers. I'm a very competitive guy. So up to this point, only 4 out of the 141 sites and services that I reviewed actually have all of those browser security features. Only 4. 12 more, which, and again, CSP is new. It is very new, and it's actually kind of hard to implement. It does take some effort and thought behind how you're developing your website even. There are 12 more that actually have everything but CSP. So not terrible, but again, 140 some odd sites. You might want a little bit better percentage than that. Keeping in mind, going back to my thesis, is like companies that give users two-factor authentication are security forward companies. that percentage doesn't say what I thought originally, right? So I kind of lost some faith after I did the math on all that. Fun things during research, a lot of headers like WordPress, X-Hacker headers, and DirectNick. Some of these companies trying to recruit basically through browser headers, like, you know, your bad HTML, like, oh, you're looking at source code in HTML, you must be a hacker, come work for us. SSL TLS. If I had had time, I would have looked at SSL v3 more specifically for Poodle, but you know, didn't quite have time to get that done before the talk. Overall, not bad. You know, anytime. So if you're not familiar with SSL Labs, it's a thing that Qualys runs, and they basically do scoring based on a ton of criteria on how good your implementation, or bad, I guess, your implementation of SSL as a protocol, as a stack, as versions, cipher suites, all that. And across the board, like anywhere A+ to a B is reasonable. You're not really falling into that category of someone's going to like execute a crazy attack against your session at any point in time. You know, things like perfect forward secrecy are going to be in an A+ rating. You know, things that we would like to see. Speaking of SSL v3, Star Wars: The Old Republic's website actually had SSL v2. So if you thought SSL v3 was super old, go Google really quick on SSL v2 and how out of date that is. The most concerning one I saw, SSL Trust is a Australian certificate company. They got a C rating on their SSL deployment. And the reason why they got a C rating is because they're running 40 and 56-bit cipher suites, which for the like 4 cryptography fans in here is terrible, like historically terrible. So that's terrifying. Maybe not by search from them. And then there's organizations like this who, you know, we take security seriously. GrrCON actually posted something about this today, which reminded me of this slide. And then you go to their site and they have an F score for their SSL deployment. And, you know, this is where rubber meets the road on boilerplate versus reality. And I think this is a good example. Again, this company deploys two-factor authentication. They give this to their customers, and they can't update their SSL settings to get that right. So what are they really doing at the end of the day? All right, more winners. So in terms of A+ ratings, from the list of 4 that we had, we're down to 2. LastPass and GitHub. And I think if you want to, like a really winner, don't say chicken dinner, don't say chicken dinner. GitHub, I believe, for X-Frames option had a better setting than LastPass. So I think GitHub technically won. What no one else did except this company, GrrCON, they don't actually use SSL. Because they say YOLO JavaScript crypto password protection. So they actually, in the DOM, protect your password using JS crypto and then send that over the wire. This is why you have to do research. Like, you have to find these hilarious things that you would never ever look at otherwise. So that's a lot of the technical detail. There's a couple other details that are a little bit more, let's call it the soft science of this project. And one of those things is security pages. Companies that think about your security, think about how they represent their own security to you. And in this case, you know, we look at some of these 3 examples are the entire section on security for these organizations. Like those 2 or 3 sentences, that is all they say about how they protect your data, how you should protect yourself, how you should use their service securely, why they're trustworthy. Like that's everything that they talk about. And that's terrifying. So the good news is, overall, companies actually do have these security pages that do in a reasonable way. Like those ones didn't count because they were like terrible boilerplate that said nothing. But people that actually have actual security pages that actually have real content about security, it's actually a majority, which is great. What's not great is that 30% of the no's, every single DNS registrar and every single DNS hosting company I looked at, every single last one of them, had nothing about how they protect your account, nothing about how you should protect your account. And if we've looked at the last couple years, there's been some really like easy to do attacks against DNS providers. You don't necessarily, like, honestly, if you're going to break into somewhere, you're not going to necessarily break into the server. You're going to pop their DNS and then change where it points. It's a much easier process when you can fax into GoDaddy and say, change my NS records to this, and they do it. So it's super duper concerning when you see companies like GoDaddy and Namecheap and Hover that don't that don't do stuff like that. There are good ones though. Bug bounties. I'm a huge bug bounty proponent. Putting out there, trying to help people out. Get bugs in, give people rewards, that kind of stuff. There are companies like Facebook has one of the best, Google has one of the best. So if you do control an organization, think long and hard about doing a bug bounty. So we have all this data. We know what kind of focus they have based on the security page. We know authentication. Again, all these have two factors, so it's kind of, again, even keel on that point. SSL deployment, browser header security, cookie security. So we have kind of this data set now to work with. What if you could score that and again go apples to apples? And what if you were me that barely passed algebra most of the time in college and made your own algorithm? You get Massacre. Massacre is my backronym poor attempt at making something that I could understand, and that may not be completely terrible. So here's what I did, and the first thing that you'll all think is that this scoring is terrible, and it's impossible to score any of this correctly because of everyone's anecdotal experience, right? So I did a 100-point scale because 100 points is super easy. And just took all these things and broke them down with some weighting as important as I could break it down to, and say like, oh, if you have CSP will stop a bunch of things. Therefore, it gets a higher weight than like one little add on like X-frames options or something, which is going to go away and be rolled into CSP soon, by the way. So things like that. You get some better points like XSS protection is something that is basically turned on by default and really only impacts, I think, IE and Safari, and it's usually by default, and it's usually just to make sure it's actually enabled. Very minor kind of protection versus a CSP or an HSTS for most attacks. And remember, this is authentication security. So think about, if I can steal your session, your authentication security kind of sucks. Like, it doesn't matter how hard it is for me to break in. If I can just grab your session cookie and put it in my browser and log in as you, that's not great authentication security in my opinion. Does anyone know that screenshot? Doom, yeah. Because if you're going to call something Massacre, Doom seemed to fit. So this is the breakdown of the scoring across all the 141 or whatever sites, and the number of those sites that fell into that range. So just like any kind of scoring, actually more than I thought, very high ones. 15 is not too bad, all things considered, when you normalize data and get bell curves and crazy things. 5 in 0 to 20. If you were paying attention to the scoring, 15 points is what everyone started with, because everyone had two-factor. So there are 5 organizations that couldn't quite like eke out like another like 2 browser headers or something. Like, that's all they did was basically two-factor. But of course, we see a lot of people in the middle, which isn't shocking. I was actually more inspired that there was, 56 people or organizations at the top. Middle ground again, but the ultra-violence nightmare levels, not great. And some of the ones you saw, like the SSL scores being like an F or a C or whatever, that certainly, played a part. So back to winners and losers. We already knew about GitHub, LastPass, per sector. So Elder Scrolls Online won for gaming, and they won with a score of a 65. That tells you very quickly how good gaming security is for web app, for end user authentication and stuff. Similarly, companies like Hootsuite, great company, big fan of Hootsuite, love using Hootsuite. But relative to like a Facebook or relative to a Twitter, in social media terms, they're actually really, really low in terms of the kind of security that they offer people, which isn't great. So there's some scores for you. But yeah, so 15, 15, 15. Those 3 companies had literally nothing but two-factor to protect their users at all. This one I'm going to skip by pretty quickly, just because it feels like a lot like the one chart I showed you earlier. I just kind of wanted to recap that data and break that down a little bit. What I do want to show you is this one. So you've got your mean, median, mode values, whichever one you're a bigger fan of. And when you look at something like CSP enabled, the score jumps, and it jumps way more than just the amount that CSP would add out of an average, for instance. And you look at something like SSL, and the score dropping in SSL is pretty dramatic. So there is some logic to companies that do some security do a lot of security better than others, and if you don't do basic things like get your SSL deployment worked out, which is super simple for the most part, you might not be cognizant enough about security to do the other things very well either. All right, here's where I troll myself for 3 minutes. So Massacre is bad and you should feel bad. Bro, do you even algorithm? And you think your data is accurate? Tell me more, it's fascinating. So, because if you can't put memes in a presentation, what do you really have in life? So, taking that data set, I actually made a Chrome extension. So the Chrome extension for that finite list of 140 sites, it takes all the data in, it tells you when they deployed two-factor, it gives you, because I did take more data in than is presented here, and all that data is available online, and I can get links if you're interested to look at the unsummarized data set. But things like 2FA instructions, the security page for the company. So if you have this extension plugged in, you can basically get their composite score full with troll facey to tell you how good or bad they're doing, and then all the features they have. And there are certainly plugins that will tell you a lot of these features anyways, but at the level of data and accuracy and two-factorness and all that, this is probably as good as you're going to get for a while. Breaches. Another thing I did is I looked for all evidence of public breaches. So whether that's a press release, that's a news story that was corroborated, and I'm not talking about DDoS attacks. I'm not talking about Anon threatened them with a hashtag online one day on Twitter. Like, I'm talking about someone had like remote code execution in that environment, someone exfiltrated data, like they were breached. Something bad happened. Of those, surprisingly, a lower number than I was expecting of breaches. And again, this is public data, so you guys know what happens on the background of companies, right? So this number's probably slightly skewed a little bit. What I did find out, though, is, again, going back to assumptions, I would have assumed that organizations that had better security than others or better features than others maybe wouldn't have been breached. The flaw in this argument, as at least one of you probably think right now, is I'm taking this data set after a breach. Guess what people do after they get breached? They layer on security and make it themselves look better, or just to do security better, right? That's a fair thing too. So in this case, I think the data might have got a little munged because of timelines. Of course, I can't go historically back and look up things as deep of resolution as I would need to do this, but in case breach data is your thing, you can look at the segments. A much higher number than I was expecting for a few of those. Perhaps if you do a lot of investigations or IR, you might not be shocked by those numbers, but certainly bigger profile ones that, social media breaches and stuff, that's a whole other thing. So after a breach, because I have the date when someone was breached, I have the date when someone deployed two-factor, so I can say, did breach occur before or after two-factor? That's an interesting data point to see reactions to getting breached, or also proactiveness prior to a breach, and things just didn't quite work out for them. And one other thing we should point out, if it's not obvious, an organization that deploys two-factor to consumers does not make a company that necessarily uses two-factor internally. That's a very important fact to factor in here. This does not say how they do their corporate security, other than the security page. That only says that how they show their consumers that they can protect themselves. So again, Bitcoin is a great example. Lots and lots of Bitcoin breaches against the organizations themselves. Very low instance of overall fraud because of the two-factor for actual accounts. So breach data, if you work for an organization, especially one that's high visibility, has a complex organization, Linode, Dropbox, MaxCDN, Buffer, all big name companies, great companies, they deployed two-factor after their breach with under a month. That is some really good agility by an organization to make a response, especially when you factor in that their peers in this data segment average a mean of 255 days and a median of 128 days. So less than 30 days for these big companies with a lot of dependencies, a lot of eyes on their organization, and they're rolling out two-factor like it's no big deal. And when you talk to some people online, and there's a really great website, twofactorauth.org, and they basically list out who has two-factor, links to how to set two-factor up, and you can ask people to enable two-factor. It's great idea. part of what they do is they'll get like a page where it'll be like a statement from the organization, and the organization will say, oh yeah, we're two-factor in, you know, in the near future. One of those companies I looked at recently said that 9 months ago. 9 months ago, and Dropbox can roll out two-factor in less than 30 days, you know. So you can see kind of the focus of security versus the illusion of a focus on security. I actually added this one after the first time I gave this talk because people like more competitions. Good news is Duo won. And in fact, the ones that I left this data as is when I made this data set. We actually have 100 now, just for what it's worth. But yeah, relatively speaking, things drop off very quickly, like concerningly quickly. Like there's a lot of red X's on there, and this is for two-factor authentication companies that you're trusting to do two-factor. So take that for what you will. Breaking stuff's way easier than doing this kind of thing. I don't care what anyone says about hacking. Like I would much rather take like a JTagulator out than do like this research ever again, because it's exhausting. You're talking to 140 companies trying to get data. You're looking at archive.org. You're Googling. You're looking for Google Cache. You're hitting web servers, trying to aggregate data, trying to populate it, trying to make graphs. It's way easier to present talks about breaking stuff. So for what that's worth. Everything still comes down to security, like actual security. So you can have whatever features you want. You can have whatever browser headers you want. Again, if I can send a fax into your DNS provider and point your DNS somewhere else, all this is for naught. Like it's still a much bigger process than a product at this point. Even the collective sum of these things is you to the end user. That's it. We're not talking about really anything other than that. It's you to the end user. There is a lot to be said about organizations that think about security and like Facebooks of the world that do security in so many ways the right way. There's a lot of good people to aspire to be like, and then hopefully in this data set you saw things that probably didn't look great. And ultimately a lot of you are responsible for environments, or at least doing assessments of environments. I hope you use some of this data or some of the process to this data to think about what you look like relative in your industry or your business sector or your competitors for some of this. So another thing that happened before or after this data is Cloudflare. Cloudflare's Universal SSL came out, and the internet doubled from 2 million sites enabled with SSL to 4 million overnight, basically. So in terms of SSL, great, solved that problem. So I can cross that one off, I guess, the list. So a couple things, we had some great interns over the summer at Duo Security. We actually have a really progressive intern program. I know a lot of students come to GrrCON. So next summer, if you're looking for an internship, please talk to Duo Security and look what we're up to. Two-factor-auth.org. Oh, I completely skipped the important part to that. Vikas and Dominic at Duo Security were interns, and they helped do a lot of the aggregation, hunt down data, pull it together. So they made my life much easier than it would have been. Two-factor-auth.org. If you are looking to enable two-factor as a consumer, so you know like how bad things are and all that great stuff. If you are looking to enable two-factor, which you should be, that's a great site to tell you where to enable it, how to enable it, what services support it, and help you make some better decisions. And then Steve Werby, who's just an amazing guy, great researcher. He did data in a similar means to this a year or two ago, and had some different points of view and different focus on like password security. Password security, why password security is not in here is if you I'm going to say factor when we're talking about two-factor too much. When you take all of these aspects into account, the password is almost like the last thing you have to worry about. Sadly, like I know we talk about password security over and over and over, but when you have two-factor and you're talking about all consumer facing sites that have two-factor, the password part kind of just drops off the map and you're like, okay, it's password. If they get owned, no big deal. Until you think about the company that I showed you where you can just answer a challenge question and log in without two-factor. So we're going to wrap up a little bit early, which is fine. You guys can get beer before you go to your next talk. Any questions? A lot of data, I know. I'm still feeling it myself. Who thinks they're going to get a good score if I went to your website right now? You guys have a leg up on that one, though. Come on. Yeah. Did anyone find any of this data like shocking? Like, were you like, oh, that's crazy that sector sucks so bad, or it's amazing that company did so well? What part of it? Yeah, I mean, and like Blizzard's one of those companies that early on deployed two-factor. Like they've had they used to have hardware tokens. I think they phased those out, and they have the soft token stuff now. But yeah, Blizzard's one of the most progressive companies in two-factor authentication for consumers, which is weird to say. Like we have all these banks and all these organizations that handle all of our data, and your gold that you have in your account is somehow more important. I don't know how that works. Yeah. Anyone else? So basically, other than the ones that were like winners or losers, again, there's 141 companies in here. So I'm not gonna like list them all out. All this data, if you shoot me an email or message me on Twitter, I actually have a blog post where the Chrome extension's at, the CSV of all this data is at, the slides are at, and some further insight. So if you're wondering if your company's in this list, or you're wondering like how again your competitors fare against you, feel free to ping me and I'll get you that data. And also, if you want to take the data, extend the data, manipulate the data, publish your own data sets, your own graphs, knock yourself out. It's for everyone. So, anyone else? Cool. Well, thank you for your time, guys. Have a good afternoon.